One more incident, and you're finished here. That's what they told the only person who had ever made a silent little girl speak again. Not the specialists, not her own mother, just a night janitor with $14 an hour and a sewing kit in his pocket. What happened next would either cost him everything or change one family forever. To understand why one warning almost destroyed everything, we need to go back to the very first night. A rainy Tuesday no one expected to matter at all. Andrew Cole is 36 years old, and he has only ever believed one thing. If he works hard enough and loves his son with everything he's got, things will turn out all right. Even on the nights the world looks straight through him. That belief got tested on a rainy Tuesday night in October inside a marble lobby that smelled like money he'd never touch, when a stranger's little girl refused to speak to another living soul on this earth except him. Here's the part nobody at Kane Global Logistics could explain. 11 of the top pediatric specialists in the state of Washington had already tried and failed. 8 caregivers had already quit. And the girl's own mother, a woman worth $2.8 billion, hadn't heard her daughter's voice in 152 days. Nobody in that building knew that the man pushing the cleaning cart down the 48th floor for $14 an hour carried a little sewing kit in his jacket pocket for reasons he never explained to a soul. Not yet, anyway. Now let's go back to where it started. It's 5:40 in the morning in a modest duplex on the south side of Seattle, and the coffee maker is the only thing awake besides Andrew. 2 years ago, cancer took his wife Marie, quiet as a thief, and left him raising their son, Leo, 5 years old, still afraid of the dark, still calling their 15-year-old minivan the old dragon, because Andrew told him once it just needed to cough a little before it woke up. Andrew makes eggs the way Leo likes them, a little burnt at the edges, and packs a lunch while cereal spills across the counter because he's rushing. He checks his bank app before he leaves, $47 until Friday, and doesn't let his face change. Not in front of his boy. He drops Leo at his mother-in-law's house on his way to the night shift, the porch swing still creaking the way it has for years. He kisses the top of Leo's head. "Be good for Grandma. I'll be back before you're even up." Then he drives 25 minutes north to a building that touches the clouds. Columbia Center, 701 Fifth Avenue. 48 floors up, wind coming hard off Elliott Bay, rattling the glass like it wants in. This is where Celeste Kane, 39 years old, runs Kane Global Logistics, a $2.8 billion company, from a corner office with a view of the water. 5 months ago, on a hiking trail called Paradise Celeste's, 8-year-old daughter Emma was the one who found her father, Daniel Kane, collapsed on the ground. He never woke up again. Daniel had co-founded the company with Celeste 16 years earlier and still kept an office 1 floor below the lobby where he served as chief strategy officer, the one person who had spent 2 years refusing every buyout offer a New York investment fund kept sending his way. Since that day, Emma hasn't spoken. Not one word. Not to her mother, not to 11 doctors from Seattle Children's Hospital and UW Medicine, not to anyone. She stopped everything except holding on to a stuffed blue rabbit with 1 torn ear and 1 torn leg, like it's the only solid thing left in the world. Celeste still goes to the office every morning. Not because the company needs her every hour, because if she stays home, she has to watch her daughter come apart and do nothing about it. And that, she has decided, is worse. Andrew Cole knows this building the way some men know Scripture. He knows which glass door will squeal if you don't lift it slightly before you push. At 11:40 on a Tuesday night, he's vacuuming outside the executive conference room on the 48th floor when he hears something small, almost nothing, coming from the supply closet. He opens the door. Emma is sitting on the floor in her pajamas, knees pulled to her chest, hugging that torn blue rabbit. She doesn't look up. Andrew doesn't pull her out. He doesn't ask if she's okay. He doesn't call security. He just lowers himself onto the carpet a yard away and pulls a small sewing kit from his jacket pocket. He starts stitching the rabbit's torn ear, talking only to the toy. "You look a little worn out tonight," he says softly. "Somebody's been pulling on this ear too hard." 8 minutes pass. Nothing moves except his needle. Then, a small hand reaches out of the shadow and holds the loose fabric steady for him, and Emma whispers hoarse, barely there, the first words she has spoken in 152 days. Don't pull it too hard. While he finishes the stitch, Andrew feels something stiff hidden inside the fabric of the rabbit's ear. Careful quiet, he opens a few threads wider and finds a small folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases, in handwriting that isn't a child's. 4 words written by a father who is no longer here. Hold tight when Mom cries. Andrew doesn't put it back. He restitches the ear closed the way it would look if nothing had been hidden there and slips the note into his own jacket pocket instead. He doesn't tell anyone. Not for a long while. He sets the mended rabbit down on the carpet between them. Emma picks it up and holds it against her chest. Andrew stands, pushes his cart back down the hallway and doesn't look back. The security camera catches all 11 minutes of it. Nobody watches the footage that night. $2.8 billion. 11 of the finest specialists money can hire. And it took a man earning $14 an hour with a needle and a little patience to do what none of them could. That's not even the part that breaks your heart. That note in the rabbit's ear. That's a bomb that hasn't gone off yet, sitting quietly in a janitor's jacket pocket waiting for the night it finally does. For 3 nights straight, something waited for Andrew Cole in the basement where the cleaning carts were kept. The blue rabbit sitting right on top of his cart. Tucked beside it, a scrap of paper in a child's crooked handwriting. Is the ear still strong? Andrew would sit on an overturned bucket, add 1 more stitch, and leave it exactly where he found it. He never asked to see. Emma never told anyone. That was the whole point. Soon Emma started showing up at the exact hour of his shift, saying little, sitting a few yards off while he worked. Some nights, she left a peppermint candy on the cart. Andrew left her paper boats folded from old desk calendars. One night, he mentioned, almost without thinking, that his own son Leo was 5 scared of the dark and convinced their minivan needed naps like a toddler. Emma didn't answer, but she listened like she was collecting it somewhere safe. It should have stayed that simple. It didn't. On his day off, Andrew spent the morning teaching Leo how to frost sugar cookies for the school bake sale, ending with more frosting on Leo's nose than on any cookie. Miss Betty stopped by with sweet tea, listening to Leo explain why the old minivan needed a nap. Andrew laughed for the first time in weeks, a small, ordinary Saturday he didn't know he'd need to remember. Every morning, a night nanny named Patrice sent Natalie Frost, the company's chief operating officer, a detailed report: what time Emma went down to the basement, how long she stayed with the janitor, what her face looked like when she came back up. Natalie paid $800 a week into an anonymous app account for those reports. Patrice, 3 months behind on rent since her husband's hours got cut at the shipyard, told herself she was just keeping an eye on things for the child's safety. She never let herself look too hard at what that money actually meant. Celeste reviewed the extra camera footage Patrice had flagged for her and believed every word. She started noticing the man who mopped the floors. She hadn't decided what to do about it yet, but Natalie Frost had already decided for her. Victor Lang, head of building security, received a quiet directive from Natalie's office and drew up an official incident report. Night shift custodial staff engaged in unsupervised contact with the CEO's minor daughter in a restricted executive area. Andrew was called to Human Resources the next afternoon. He stood in a windowless office, uniform still damp from mopping, and listened to a write-up land in his file. Unsupervised contact, restricted area, read aloud by a man who'd never had to choose between rent and a full tank of gas. He was banned, effective immediately, from every floor above the 40th. One more incident and he'd be terminated on the spot. His work in the basement and on the sub-level engineering deck was untouched by the order, small comfort, but the only reason what happened next was even possible. He didn't argue, didn't explain himself, didn't mention the folded note in his jacket pocket or the 11 minutes of silence that had done what 11 specialists couldn't. Some things he'd learned a long time ago don't sound believable to people who've already made up their minds about who you are. He drove home that night the old truck, coughing twice before it caught, and sat on the porch step next to Miss Betty, without saying a word for a long time. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just handed him a cup of coffee and let the quiet sit between them, the kind that says, I see you're carrying something and I'm not going anywhere until you're ready to put it down." That should have been the end of it. Instead, the first night, Andrew was banned from the upper floors. Emma slipped down to the basement anyway, riding the staff elevator on a code she'd memorized from riding it with her mother 100 times before. She left the blue rabbit on his cart, same as always, but this time tucked inside the rabbit's mended leg was something new. A small, old brass key, and a folded note in the same crooked handwriting. "Dad's key, engineering floor." Andrew held that key in his palm a long time before he pocketed it. That night, after his shift technically ended, he let himself into Daniel Kane's old office on the sub-level engineering deck, a room that had sat locked and untouched since the funeral right down the hall, from where Andrew mopped every night without ever once trying the door. Inside a locked desk drawer were a handful of handwritten letters that had never been sent, and a small USB drive labeled in neat handwriting, "Not for sale." Andrew took the drive. He didn't plug it into anything. Not yet. He just held it the same way he'd held that folded note in the rabbit's ear, carefully, like it might still be able to hurt someone. Emma stopped coming to the basement after that. Celeste noticed her daughter had started sitting by the penthouse window every night, instead staring in the direction of Columbia Center, her eyes emptier than they'd been in weeks. This story is about how far a child will go and how much a system will punish a good man for showing up without asking anything in return. An 8-year-old had just broken every rule in that building to return a stitched-up rabbit and a dead man's key to the one person who never once demanded she explain herself. And a working father who fixes his own porch swing was about to lose the only job keeping his family afloat for the crime of being kind at the wrong time to the wrong person's daughter. And somewhere above him, Natalie Frost was already planning her next move, using a nanny's paycheck and a child's grief as pieces on a board only she could see. What's actually on that drive, and what she's preparing to do with it, is where things are about to turn. Andrew just risked the only paycheck feeding his own 5-year-old son to keep quietly showing up for a stranger's grieving daughter. Team Loyalty says he should have protected his own boy first and walked away the moment HR gave him a warning. Team Compassion says some children need you more than a paycheck ever will, no matter the risk. Comment Team Loyalty or Team Compassion. A storm rolled into Seattle, the way storms off the Pacific do, sudden, mean, and loud. Wind tore branches loose along Fifth Avenue, rain hit the windows sideways, and power flickered through the downtown grid, every screen in the building blinking like it was holding its breath. Emma was up in her mother's office on the 48th floor that evening, curled into the corner of a leather chair with the blue rabbit tucked under her chin. When Celeste's meeting with 2 investors wrapped up, Emma followed toward the elevator, quiet as always, watching the numbers over the door instead of the adults around her. The elevator carrying her and the 2 investors stalled between the 47th and 48th floors, the cab dropping half a foot before the emergency brakes caught with a metallic groan. The lights cut halfway out. Emma's breathing turned to short, frantic pulls of air, her fists hitting the glass panel of the door, not hard but fast, over and over, the sound carrying through the building's intercom. Down on the sub-level engineering deck, Andrew heard it crackle through a maintenance radio he had no real reason to still be listening to. A child's fists were hitting glass, and Andrew Cole had never once needed permission to do the right thing. He took the stairwell 2 steps at a time until he reached the stalled car, knelt at the seam of the door, and spoke through the gap, voice low and even. "Emma, the rabbit's right here with me, his ears still strong. I'm not going anywhere. You can stop hitting the door now." For a moment, nothing. Then Emma answered, shaky but clear, the first time she'd let anyone besides Andrew hear her voice at all. "Don't turn off the lights." When the doors finally forced open, Emma didn't run to her mother waiting just down the hallway. She ran straight into Andrew and wrapped both arms around him like he was the only fixed point left in a spinning building. Nobody said a word about the floor ban that night or any night after. Celeste had been standing not 30 feet away, arms already open, heels clicking fast against the marble. She watched her daughter run straight past her, past the mother who had spent 5 months and 11 specialists trying to reach her, and disappear into the arms of a man in a gray custodial uniform. For one long second, Celeste didn't feel relief. She felt something closer to grief, standing perfectly still while her own child chose someone else's arms over hers. Celeste had spent 16 years believing enough money and the right specialist could fix anything broken. What froze her on that marble floor wasn't jealousy, it was discovering that the one thing she couldn't buy was her own daughter's trust. Watching Emma run past cracked open a fear she'd never said aloud, that she'd already lost her daughter the same day she lost her husband and simply hadn't let herself notice until now. It would take her weeks to understand that what she felt wasn't rejection. It was the first real evidence in 5 months that her daughter still knew how to reach for anyone at all. An office employee caught the whole thing on a phone camera, and within 20 minutes the clip had torn through the company's internal group chats. The bond between a night janitor and the CEO's daughter laid bare in front of hundreds of eyes, with no context, only a story they were eager to fill in themselves. While checking equipment after the storm, Andrew discovered that the power surge had jolted the maintenance radio's aging recorder app back to life, capturing nearly 20 unattended minutes on the channel, including Natalie Frost, caught on the 50th floor landing mid-phone call saying words she never meant for anyone to hear. Push the stock price down before next week's meeting. Let the story about the kids spread as far as it wants to. Andrew played it back once, jaw tight but otherwise still, and saved the audio. Within hours, Natalie had already used the elevator footage to call an emergency board meeting. She stood at the head of the long glass table, dressed sharp and certain, and played the clip twice, Emma running past her own mother into a stranger's arms, before turning to the room with a practiced, sorrowful expression. "I raised this," she said, "only out of concern for the child. If a CEO's own daughter feels safer with custodial staff than with her mother, the board has every right to ask what that says about her judgment both as a parent and as the person steering this company." It landed exactly the way she meant it to. 2 board members exchanged glances. Legal counsel started taking notes faster. In one sentence, Natalie had turned an 8-year-old's private pain into a political weapon in front of shareholders who now had a reason to ask whether Celeste Kane still belonged in the chair she'd held for a decade. For the first time, Celeste was humiliated in her own boardroom over her own daughter by a woman who knew exactly which pressure point to press. What started as a janitor might lose his job had jumped in a single afternoon into a woman might lose control of a $2.8 billion company. A little girl running past her billionaire mother, straight into the arms of the man who mops the floors, and in the same afternoon a boardroom conspiracy quietly caught on a radio nobody thought was recording. How does someone build an empire and still miss what matters most right in front of her? That recording is still sitting in Andrew's jacket pocket, a bomb nobody upstairs knows exists yet. And the board, shaken and unsure, is about to decide the fate of 2 very different people without knowing the full truth about either one. What Natalie Frost doesn't know is that her play for power just collided head-on with a quiet man who never once raised his voice to defend himself, because he's about to do something far more effective than that. What happens to that board meeting and what Andrew decides to do with the recording sitting in his jacket pocket, that's coming up next. Celeste held on to her seat that day, barely. She walked into the emergency board meeting carrying the full file of 11 failed specialists, every report, every dead end, every dollar spent trying to reach her daughter, and laid it out on the table like evidence in her own defense. She made her case with a steadiness that surprised even her own lawyers, reminding the board that she had tried everything money could buy, long before a night janitor ever entered the picture. The board issued Natalie Frost a formal warning and, for the moment, let the matter rest. It felt like a win. It wasn't only the quiet before something bigger. Late that same night, emptying wastebaskets in the executive suite, Andrew found a printed bank transfer receipt someone had tossed out without a second thought. A large sum wired from a New York investment fund straight into Natalie Frost's personal account. The memo line read, "Advisory fee pre-deal." He photographed it on his phone, hands steady, and saved it beside the audio recording from the storm. The next afternoon, Leo carried something to kindergarten in his backpack. A folded paper Emma had once left on Andrew's cart, a drawing of the blue rabbit with a few crooked words underneath, "For your boy, too." Andrew had pinned it to the fridge, and Leo had decided it belonged at show and tell, telling his classmates it was from "my dad's friend Emma." His teacher, who'd followed the local coverage of Daniel Kane's death and his daughter's long silence, put the pieces together fast and called both fathers in for a meeting, pulling the whole quiet arrangement out into the open. 2 days later, Leo's kindergarten sent home a second, less charming note. Andrew's 5-year-old son had started pulling away exactly the way Emma once had, going silent with his teacher barely touching his lunch, sitting alone by the window. His grandmother called Andrew in tears. "He won't tell me what's wrong, Andrew. He just watches the door." That same week, a warehouse in Tacoma offered Andrew a day shift position nearly double his current pay, steady hours, real insurance for Leo. It was on paper everything a tired single father was supposed to want. He sat alone in the basement locker room that night with 2 pieces of paper spread out in front of him, a resignation letter and a photograph of a bank receipt that could end someone's career. He thought about the porch swing, the burnt eggs, the $47 that used to sit in his account until payday. He thought about Leo watching the classroom door instead of playing. For the first time since Marie died, Andrew Cole didn't know what the right thing to do even looked like. Andrew had built his whole sense of worth around one job being enough for Leo. Choosing Tacoma meant proving he could still be that steady, present, unremarkable in all the right ways. But some quiet part of him understood that walking away from Emma now would confirm the exact thing people like Natalie already assumed about men like him, that kindness was negotiable once the price got high enough. He wasn't really torn between a job and a little girl. He was torn between 2 different versions of the father he'd promised himself he'd become. Word reached Emma through Patrice that Andrew might be leaving the building for good. It broke something in her that hadn't broken yet. She stopped eating entirely, went nearly 48 hours without drinking water, her lips cracked. She had to be rushed to Seattle Children's Hospital and placed under observation for severe dehydration. For the first time, Celeste faced the very real possibility of Child Protective Services stepping in. A doctor told her plainly, "If this continues, we won't have a choice but to look at the home environment." Celeste sat by Emma's hospital bed that night, holding a small hand hooked to an IV line, and understood, maybe for the first time in her career, that no amount of money could buy her way out of this room. Emma wasn't just silent anymore. She was hurting her own body because the one person who never asked her to speak was about to disappear from her life. Andrew stood at the center of 2 impossible choices: leave and maybe save his own son, stay and maybe save a little girl who wasn't his to save. The night before Andrew was set to accept the Tacoma job, Celeste found him mopping the basement floor for what both of them understood might be the last time. She didn't say much. She held out a piece of paper, something Emma had written before being admitted to the hospital. The letters, shaky but legible: "Dad's gone and Mom cries every night. I stopped talking so Mom wouldn't hear one more sad sound. Andrew never asked me to talk, so I could." Andrew read the note twice, his hands going still on the mop handle. Then he sat down, right there in the hallway, back against the cold tile wall, and for the first time in 2 years, not at Marie's funeral, not once, not in front of Leo, he let himself cry in front of another person. Celeste lowered herself down next to him on the floor, still in her heels, still in her tailored blazer, and didn't say a single word. She just stayed there, shoulder against his, because for once in her life, Celeste Kane understood that silence was the right answer. The man who had been treated all along like an outsider, a problem to be managed by human resources, was now the only person capable of keeping a child breathing in every sense that mattered. Sometimes doing the right thing leaves no clean choice at all, just 2 children who both need you, and a father who has to decide which heartbreak he can carry. A little girl in a hospital bed. A boy going quiet at school. A conspiracy sitting in a photograph on Andrew's phone still unused. And a man who has to choose. Who Andrew chooses, and whether the truth about Natalie Frost ever sees daylight, that's what happens next. The next morning, Andrew never showed up in Tacoma. Instead, he walked into an emergency board meeting Celeste had called at first light, still in his cleaning uniform, dust from the night shift still on his sleeves, boots squeaking softly against marble that had never once been walked across by someone in his position. Nobody stopped him at the door. A few board members exchanged glances, unsure what a custodian was doing at a meeting like this. Somehow, everyone in that room already understood he needed to be there. Celeste gave a short introduction, her voice even.
"This is Andrew Cole. He's going to finish what I started yesterday."
He set his phone on the polished conference table in front of the full board Celeste's legal counsel and Natalie Frost herself, who sat up straighter, her jaw tightening the moment she recognized his face. Then he pressed play. Natalie's own voice filled the room, caught by a maintenance radio she never knew was recording. "Push the stock price down before next week's meeting. Let the story about the kids spread as far as it wants to." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed too loud. Andrew pulled up one more image, the bank transfer receipt, the New York fund, the memo line reading, "Advisory fee pre-deal," and turned the screen so the whole table could see it. Natalie started to explain herself, her voice climbing higher with every word. But before she got far, a young IT staffer stood up from the back of the room. A man Andrew had quietly helped more than once, fixing a jammed office printer at 2 in the morning without ever mentioning it to anyone. He laid out a folder of original emails between Natalie and the outside investment fund, spelling out the entire buyout scheme in writing. The room went cold and silent in a way boardrooms rarely do. Natalie's practiced composure finally cracked. She looked around the table for an ally and found none. Just a row of faces that had 24 hours earlier been ready to believe every word out of her mouth. "This is a misunderstanding," she started. Nobody in the room bothered to argue with her. The silence did that job for them. Security escorted her out within the hour. Her company accounts were frozen before the meeting even ended. By the end of that same week, word of the recording and the emails had reached federal regulators, and the Securities and Exchange Commission confirmed it had opened a formal inquiry into securities fraud and market manipulation tied to the New York fund's pre-deal payments. It was the kind of public reckoning that doesn't just cost someone their job, it costs them everything they'd built their name on. The kind of fall that doesn't leave much room for a second act. Celeste watched it happen from the head of the table, arms crossed, jaw tight, thinking about 11 specialists, 8 caregivers, and 152 silent days, all of it circling back in the end to a man she had once looked at with polite, distant suspicion, simply because of the uniform he wore. The USB drive Andrew had carried out of Daniel's old office weeks earlier turned out to hold nothing dramatic, just backed up files and a folder of emails where Daniel had flatly rejected the New York fund's offers year after year, calling the company not for sale in nearly every reply. It wasn't evidence of a crime, it was proof of exactly how long Natalie had been waiting for her chance and exactly whose voice had been the only thing standing in her way. Andrew handed the drive over to Celeste's legal counsel without a word. Patrice didn't wait to be confronted. She resigned by email before the board meeting had even finished, the $800 a week gone as quickly as it had come, along with any chance of ever working in that building again. Celeste looked at Andrew for a long moment after the room had mostly cleared out. She didn't say thank you, not exactly. What she said was quieter than that, and it landed harder. "You stayed," she said, "when everyone else only knew how to ask questions." Emma was discharged from Seattle Children's Hospital that same afternoon, stable color back in her cheeks once word reached her that Andrew hadn't left after all. That evening, for the first time, the two children met properly. No basement, no supply closet, no secret elevator codes, just the wide, sunlit lobby on the ground floor of Columbia Center. Glass walls letting in the late light off Elliott Bay, gold and orange spilling across the marble floor. Celeste stood off to one side with Andrew, neither of them saying much, both of them watching closely. Without hovering, the way parents do when they sense a moment is bigger than they are. Emma set the blue rabbit down on the floor between herself and Leo, and the two of them settled onto the marble tile without either adult needing to suggest it. She looked at him and spoke clearly in full sentences for the first time to anyone in this world besides Andrew. His ear used to be torn. It's strong now. You're going to be okay too. Leo answered her back shy but steady the way 5-year-olds do when they've decided someone is safe. The old dragon's ear is fine too, he said, pointing at nothing in particular, and somehow it made perfect sense to both of them. Emma laughed, a small rusty sound like a door opening after a long time shut, and for a moment neither Celeste nor Andrew could speak at all. It was a small moment, but it carried weight nobody in that lobby could ignore. Two children from two entirely different worlds, sitting shoulder to shoulder, like the distance between rich and poor had simply stopped mattering, at least for that hour. A handful of employees passing through the lobby slowed down without quite meaning to, watching a scene none of them could have explained if asked. This story reminds us what real justice actually looks like. Not a courtroom drama, not a dramatic confession. Just a man in a dusty uniform walking into a room full of power and laying the truth on the table plainly without needing to raise his voice once. A janitor exposed a scheme that money and title couldn't touch, and in the very same afternoon, two children who had never been formally introduced sat down together, like the space between their two worlds had never existed at all. There's still something coming that neither Celeste nor Andrew has said out loud yet. Something that's going to change what this whole story actually means. That part comes next. 3 months later, Andrew Cole was officially promoted to Day Shift Facilities Coordinator. A title with real hours, real benefits, and enough pay to finally hire someone dependable to watch Leo in the afternoons. He still keeps that same 15-year-old minivan in the parking garage, still calls it the Old Dragon, along with his son, because some things you don't trade in just because your paycheck got bigger. Miss Betty still sits on the porch some evenings, listening to Leo tell increasingly elaborate stories about school, and Andrew still burns the eggs on purpose most mornings because his son likes them that way, and there's no reason good enough to change it now. Emma and Leo started attending a small joint therapy group together at Seattle Children's Hospital, built on a method that has no official textbook. Just the simple idea that sometimes what a hurting child needs isn't a solution or a diagnosis. It's someone willing to sit down at their level and never once ask them to explain themselves. Every Friday evening, the two kids sit together on the rug in Celeste's penthouse living room, the wide windows over Elliott Bay turning gold with the last of the daylight. Andrew sits nearby on an old worn sofa he hauled up from his own duplex because Celeste asked him to bring something of his own into that glass tower, and that beat-up sofa was the truest thing he owned. Some nights the kids talk. Some nights they just sit quietly, and that's fine too. The blue rabbit stays in the middle of the rug, both ears strong now, one leg stitched in a different color thread. Emma asked for that on purpose. She said, so he has a scar like a real person. Then one quiet Friday evening, Andrew did something nobody expected. He reached into his jacket, the same jacket, patched at one elbow now, that he'd worn every night shift for years, and took out a small folded piece of paper, soft at the creases from being carried so long. I found this the very first night, he said quietly to Celeste, not quite able to look at Emma yet. Sewn inside the rabbit's ear. I didn't know if it was mine to give you. I think I was just waiting for the right Friday. Celeste had never known it existed. She unfolded it with hands that weren't quite steady and read her late husband's handwriting out loud for the first time in 5 months. Hold tight when Mom cries. Emma went very still. Emma's silence had never really been about the trail or even about losing her father. It had been about protecting the one parent she had left. A child that age doesn't reason her way into going quiet. She simply stops handing over anything that could be used to hurt someone. And for months, every word had felt like one more weight her mother might break under. What changed wasn't the note itself. It was watching two adults finally choose plain honesty over careful control right there in front of her. Proof at last that the truth could be spoken out loud in that house without anyone shattering. Then she stood up on her own, walked over, and took the note gently from her mother's hands, holding it the way she used to hold the rabbit, like it was the only solid thing in the room. When she finally spoke, it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was everything she'd been carrying since the day she stopped talking, all of it out loud, all at once. I held tight. Mom doesn't cry every night anymore. Andrew never made me talk so I could. Then she reached out and took her mother's hand in one of hers, and Andrew's hand in the other, and held both of them at the same time. Every specialist appointment, every board meeting, every scheme, every threat, every impossible choice Andrew had faced in that basement and that hospital hallway. All of it had simply been the long road leading to one small girl finally saying what she'd needed to say all along. There was no grand announcement, no wedding bells, no fortune-changing hands. Just 3 people, a 5-month-old note, and a blue stuffed rabbit sitting together on a rug. To this day, on the small desk in the engineering room where Andrew works, there's always a sewing kit laid out along with a few blank sheets of paper, just in case there's ever another child out there who needs something quietly mended. This story reminds us that the world doesn't always reward the loudest voice in the room, or the biggest bank account, or the fanciest title on a business card. Sometimes it rewards the person who shows up on time, keeps their word, and never once asks somebody to prove they deserve kindness before it's given. If there's a young man in your life who reminds you of Andrew, quiet, works with his hands, fixes things without being asked, never brags because he was raised to believe good work speaks for itself, don't just think well of him. Call him this week and tell him one specific thing you saw him do right. Not, "You're a good man," something exact. "I noticed you fixed your mother's porch step without her even asking." That's rare. Specific praise is the kind that gets remembered at 2 a.m. years later. Vague praise gets forgotten by dinner. If you're widowed and the house has gotten too quiet, don't wait for the phone to ring. Pick one neighbor, the one whose spouse also passed, the one who waves from the driveway but never quite stops to talk. And knock on their door Saturday morning with 2 cups of coffee, no agenda beyond sitting on the porch for 20 minutes. Andrew and Miss Betty never fixed each other with advice. They just sat together and let the quiet be shared instead of carried alone. And if retirement has made you feel like you've stopped mattering to anyone, remember this. Nobody in that boardroom could buy what Andrew gave away for free, night after night, expecting nothing back. Your time still does that. Bring the photo albums that need sorting to your grandchild instead of asking how school is going. Working side by side is where people actually talk. That's not some day's assignment, that's this week's. The soul of these stories comes from human experience, empathy, and courage. AI assisted only in language refinement, so that timeless, usable lessons of justice, compassion, and standing up for one's family could move and educate viewers everywhere.